Welcome to the Center for American Progress. Thank you for joining us for today's event. We'd like to ask you to please silence your mobile devices, and if you've brought a laptop or a tablet, please mute notifications or put these items on Do Not Disturb. When our question and answer period begins, please raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. Remember to state your name and affiliation. Please, one question per guest. Thank you again for being present. The event will start soon.
It's on. Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Center for American Progress and today's event entitled Extinguishing the Fires of Political Violence, a bipartisan discussion about current threats and potential solutions. My name is Naveen Nayak, and I'm a counselor with the Center for American Progress, and really thrilled to welcome everyone here in person and those joining online. The Center for American Progress is a progressive think tank whose mission is to improve the lives of all Americans. And while we maintain big aspirations about what America can and should be, we are pragmatic about what it will take to get there. And I've always welcomed the opportunity to work with other Americans with different views from our own when we can find common cause. And so we're thrilled to, our co-hosts today are the McCain Institute, a conservative think tank inspired by Senator John McCain and his family's dedication to public service. They follow the model of the respected senator to create a safe, free, safe, and just world for all. Before I describe what today's discussion about political violence will entail, let me introduce our two guests, special guests. First, Senator Doug Jones, who is now a distinguished senior fellow at CAP, where he focuses his work on issues of racial justice and equality, voting rights and democracy, and law enforcement reform. He represented Alabama in the U.S. Senate from 2018 to 2021, where he was known for achieving results working across the political aisle. Before serving as senator, Senator Jones was a U.S. attorney in the Northern District of Alabama. And during his public service in that job, he successfully prosecuted 2 of the 4 men responsible for the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, finally bringing full justice and closure nearly 40 years after the attack that killed 4 young girls. His legal career has been one of fighting for justice for people too often overlooked and for upholding the rule of law. Next, let me introduce the Honorable Barbara Comstock. Congresswoman Comstock represented Virginia's 10th district in the U.S. House from 2015 to 2019, where she was widely admired for her leadership and tenacity. Before that, Representative Comstock served as a member of the Virginia House of Delegates from 2010 to 2014. She is now a senior advisor at the firm Baker Donaldson. And Representative Comstock has been a leading conservative voice and champion for upholding the foundations of our democracy and the rule of law. She recently co-authored a major New York Times op-ed about the need for attorneys around the nation and across the ideological spectrum to step up and protect our nation from sliding into authoritarianism. Now to today's discussion. There are a lot of issues that do require Democrats and Republicans coming together to find solutions, though perhaps none is more fundamental than protecting and strengthening our democracy, the very foundation for every other conversation in this country. It's important that we have parties with different points of view on how to move America forward. But in order to maintain that ability to debate and disagree, there are ideas and views that must supersede our allegiance to a political party or to a particular ideology. Democracy and upholding the rule of law are such issues. Being an American must always be more important than being a Democrat or than being a Republican or a progressive or a conservative. Today, too many are willing to enable political violence or even fail to denounce it when it occurs, reflecting this willingness to put their party above the country. Today's discussion is rooted in the unfortunate reality that political leaders are increasingly using extremist language and emotional cues that inflame grievances, which some Americans understand, to authorize or condone physical harm to opponents or public officials. Often referred to as dog whistles, this rhetoric and the violence it engenders are intended to delegitimize political opponents. But this also undermines the structures of our democracy, like free and fair elections. So we're thrilled for today's discussion, which will be a compelling one, as we hear views from these 2 former members of Congress from opposing sides of the aisles. Senator Jones and Representative Comstock undoubtedly disagree on many substantive policy issues, but they agree on the fundamental issue of protecting our democracy. And they specifically agree that political violence poses a real threat, present and existential threat to our democracy. And they're among many Americans who believe that this dangerous dynamic cannot continue and that the trend line is going in the wrong direction. Together, we have to find our way back to drawing bright lines against political violence and unequivocal support for democratic norms and practices. And so we're excited to co-host this conversation as a part of that process. With that, let me turn it over to Paul Fagan, Director of Democracy Programs at the McCain Institute, our co-host, to say a few words.
Thanks so much, Naveen. Well, I'm so pleased to be here today representing the McCain Institute. As noted, my name's Paul Fagan. I'm the director of the democracy program at the McCain Institute. And as Naveen mentioned, we carry on the legacy of Senator John McCain, who many of you know and is a stalwart in American political history. I think many of us remember in 2008, a historic election, but I think one of the most important moments of that election was Senator McCain's concession speech. It was probably one of the most memorable transfer of power speeches probably in this country and around the world. And when we are recognized for political transitions and civility in politics, I think many of us remembered that speech very clearly that night. So we're very happy to be here at the Center for American Progress. We believe civility in politics, where we can get along. We might have differing views on issues, but at the end of the day, this is about America, strengthening institutions. And we here at the McCain Institute, along with Center for American Progress, believe in those true American values. With that being said, I know we want to get to the conversation. So if Representative Comstock and Senator Jones can join us on the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Appropriate you to sit on the right side for the audience. Welcome, everybody. And for those online, we really appreciate you coming today. And we really appreciate CAP as well as the McCain Institute for hosting this. This truly is something that Barbara and I have talked about before. We've done a number of media interviews together. We're also members of the Former Members of Congress Association. And this is an area that we both are concerned about. We both felt the threats that were coming in when we were in the House and me in the Senate. And it's something that I think is getting more attention, and that's good. And I appreciate the fact that the Center for American Progress and McCain are really raising that. And we hope to do more. There are some other meetings going on about these issues, and I think you'll see more from us down the road. I want to get started, Barbara. As I mentioned, we're both members of the Former Members of Congress Association, which is a great group. I've enjoyed my time with that. And recently, the Former Members Association partnered with the University of Massachusetts to do a poll of its members. And there were about 300 people, 300 former members of Congress that responded, taking a survey, and they were evenly split. And this is really important. This is evenly split, about 55% Democrat, 45% Republican. I call that even for purposes of polling, okay? One of the most consistent and frightening findings in the poll was an increase in the number and frequency of threats toward members of Congress. You heard that, but this came from members themselves. Not only the members, but also their families. 47% of respondents indicated they had received threats at least somewhat frequently during their tenure. 49% of those were Republicans, 46% were Democrats. Even more troubling, quite frankly, was that the percentage was even greater for female members of Congress. 69% of the female former members reported receiving threats at least somewhat frequently. Now, what do you think? Did that surprise you that those results based on your experience and what we're seeing right now?
Unfortunately, it didn't. And this was former members. I also mentioned that it was more frequent for both females and minorities.
Right.
So for female and minority, so if you're female and minority, it was even more. So we had this discussion recently with at a former members event. And so myself and former member Donna Edwards discussed this. And this was certainly her experience as a member. And so you have to remember, this is former members who are participating in this. If you asked current members, of course, this is even more so. And, you talk to the Capitol Police, which, you and I have talked with and discussed these issues with, and certainly after January 6th, they could tell you that these threats have increased. Liz Cheney has talked about this in a recent book. Certainly Liz and Adam were among those who got some of the worst threats during, following January 6th. Those who voted for impeachment got those increased threats, and we certainly know where a lot of those came from. But it was, this was starting before. I know you experienced them, during confirmation hearings. I experienced them when I was there, when big issues came up, Obamacare, which I actually ended up voting against repeal of Obamacare because Mark Meadows convinced Donald Trump to pull out the pre-existing condition deal that we wanted to have in there. So, even with those kind of things going on, this has been increasing, and the FBI has been warning us about that for years.
Yeah, and when I was, obviously, I was only in the Senate 3 years, but we had some really tough issues, both impeachment, the first one, I was there for that one. The Kavanaugh issues were really tough with a lot of emotions and a lot of threats coming in. After the election in 2020, there was one guy who called my office who ultimately went to prison. And I couldn't figure that out. He was calling it was we're going to hang Doug Jones. True story about that. And I couldn't figure that out. So I said, hell, I lost too. I don't know why you're calling to threaten me, for goodness sakes. But
I know that happened to my colleague, Congressman John Katko. And that was before he
Yes.
voted for impeachment. He got death threats that I believe that caused somebody to go to jail.
What
Yeah.
troubles me, I think, the most aside from the fact that they're an increase, what's troubling me also is that it seems to be normalizing itself. The media, folks, just the people I meet and talk to, it's just become commonplace, almost like mass shootings have just become another news story. And to some extent, to me, I don't know how you feel about that, but I even think the media just treats this as, well, there was another threat, there was another violent incident. Now let's move on to the latest poll that we see coming out of
Well, and
New Hampshire.
one of the other aspects of the poll was 84% of these members who took the poll were very concerned regarding the violence, regarding the 2024 race. And that included 74% of Republicans, and I believe it was 94% of Democrats. So going into the election, this is something that's very concerned, and the permission structure that's been
Right.
created for
Well,
that.
that's an important point. And folks, we could spend most of this hour historically talking about the incidents of threats and violence that has occurred. We're not going to try to do that. I mean, you're here because you're interested and you know all those. You see them, you likely follow them. But we want to talk some about really where things are in political rhetoric, what I call the dog whistles, that are out there where people are using. And those can be both intentional and unintentional. I grew up in a time in the Jim Crow South. I was born in a time and I saw the dog whistles of the racist governors and others. And I saw the reactions. Naveen mentioned the church bombing. The church bombing in Birmingham occurred 3 weeks after the governor of Alabama said we need to stop the civil rights movement with a few first-class funerals. 3 weeks. And you got to draw a direct line there. So political leaders, both intentionally, I believe that there are some in this who will go unnamed, but initials are DT, have an intent. I think they've had it before and they know exactly what they're saying. How do we look at that? How do we talk when you got political leaders that are out there who are literally calling for the execution of a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who are calling their political opponents vermin that needs to be exterminated? That is a clear signal to folks.
Well, I think we have to get back to the kind of leadership. I know my first year in Congress was the 50th anniversary of in Alabama, and John Lewis brought us all
Right.
down to Alabama, and it was bipartisan. And every year he took people down. So we went down and we all walked across the Pettus Bridge together. And I know Eric Cantor told me, when I went into Congress, because you have to go on that trip.
Right.
That's something
What year was
you
that?
have to do. That was 2015.
Okay.
And so that was, I remember my staff saying, wait, you just got in here. What do you do? I said, that's the first thing that was on the list that I, put that weekend down. We're doing that, and encouraged other members to go. And that was one of the most meaningful things that I got to do. And it was such a nonpartisan, it was a religious experience. I mean, that's how John Lewis
Right.
Did it. And it was something where members were all together there in a nonpartisan way. And all the former presidents, I believe, were there, if I'm remembering it correctly. And we were visiting all of the churches, and you saw that
Yep.
history, and because you've been there too. And I think when you saw this week, to bring it to this week, the experience with the university presidents and the anti-Semitism that we couldn't call, what was, anti-Semitism, and the furor that has come up, rightfully so, there, and the blowback that has been there. These are simple things that when we all see them, we should be able to say them. And, if everyone walked in the shoes of the people who were experiencing that on campus, whether it was anti-Semitism or racism or anti-Muslim hate. I mean, I had a large Muslim population, so I was dealing with anti-Muslim issues because of things that Donald Trump had done. So when you walk in the shoes of people who have experienced these kind of, the kind of racism of any sort, it's very simple to know the answer. So that was what was so beautiful about what John Lewis did for us. And I think that we need to get back to that experience of members going and walking in those shoes. And maybe what Congress needs to do now is go up to Harvard, go to University of Pennsylvania, go with those students who've experienced the racism that they've experienced and walk through exactly what they've experienced.
There's nothing like,
and instead of having hearings, do what John Lewis did.
I have told folks two things. Number one, on the pilgrimage, the March pilgrimage every year to Selma, Alabama, because I've been going for a long time now. I mean, probably 20 years or more off and on. But Barbara, one of the things that I have seen since you were there on that 50th anniversary is that the bipartisanship has dwindled for that trip. And we need to get that back. I think it truly has dwindled. And now you don't see as many Republicans going, trying to not be political here. It's just a fact. And it's noticeable. It is very noticeable when folks don't come and experience that and see that. And I love the idea. Our former members of Congress Association does a Congress to Campus program that we might ought to try to think about stepping up a little bit in this arena, because when we go to these campuses, what we are demonstrating is governing and civility and trying to work together. So maybe we should do that a little bit. But, one of the things, it's one thing to hear people that you can listen to and see and know that they are calling for violence. But it's another when people in this social media world, video game world, whatever we do, where everybody likes tough guys and they want to fight all the time. They want to put ads on TV where you're shooting guns and all this thing. There's a lot of unintentional messages out there that I don't think people understand, that there's somebody out there seeing something and hearing something different than what they're intended. Because I truly believe that a lot of people that I see on TV, a lot of political leaders do not intend for violence, but they also don't understand fully the consequences, some of the rhetoric they said.
Or they don't want to call it out when it's on the other side. So it was very, with the university presidents, that would be a favorite for Republicans to call out, right? So it was Republicans who were calling that out, but good for, President Biden called it out also. So, thank you for President Biden for calling that out. But the same people who were calling out the university presidents this week were also not people who called out Donald Trump for bringing anti-Semites to Mar-a-Lago and having dinner with some of the most extreme anti-Semites and saying nothing about that, or making the kind of comments he made about vermin and making, or when, I remember back to 2016, when Donald Trump said, hey, David Duke, yeah, okay, he says he likes me, yeah, that's okay. So, you can't just call it out when it's convenient because it's your opponents making, or people you don't like making these kind of comments. You have to be consistent on this. And that's one of the, as you said, people don't, it's very easy to do when it's the other side, but you have to, we have to get it right here that it's wrong no matter who's doing it. And that's one of the problems with this partisanship is it's only, people are only calling it out when it's convenient to their political purposes.
Absolutely. And statistically right now, if you look at the FBI, there's a lot coming from the extreme right in terms of violence. But that's not always been the case. For those of you old enough to remember here, and I see a couple of folks out there, the Weather Underground and the folks in the early 70s, there were like 5,000 bombs placed by the left political left in this country in the early 1970s. But you did not hear, it was not silence coming from the left-leaning political folks. They were all condemning that. And I think that there's something really to be said, I think, for folks, at least bringing it to somebody's attention. You don't have to call for their ouster of Congress, out of Congress or whatever, but at least bringing that to people's attention, that this could have consequences. Words matter, and it can have a grave consequences. We've seen some of that recently, I think, on both the right and the left, where people are using language. We saw it last night in the GOP debate. We saw it with a Democratic member of Congress, where people are using some language that other people see as a call to arms, a call to violence. And that is really tragic, I think, that we see. But how do we encourage not just political leaders, but elected officials and others? How do we encourage them at the risk of their own political power, at the risk of alienating people that support them? How do we get them to stand up and speak out? And as our friend John Lewis said, cause a little good trouble.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I had a great interfaith community in my district and in Virginia that was very good about when say a hate crime happened and people didn't even know maybe who was responsible for it. So, and the interfaith community would kind of jump into action before they even knew who was responsible. So you didn't know, did this come from the right or the left or who did it? The community all came together and said, whoever did this, we're all together, we're standing together. And they would make a point of coming together so that before anyone wanted to point fingers, they were together. And it really was kind of beautiful how that worked out. Now, unfortunately, as we're seeing these days, just like you said, maybe things are getting more partisan in that area, as we're seeing with Tim Alberta's new book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. Even our churches are getting more partisan, which is sad. But I think we've got to make sure that doesn't happen either, because we need our churches in the interfaith community to bring us together on these issues and know that we are all children of God. And that, because when when we have these issues going on in the Middle East, here in this country, we are an interfaith community. And when these kind of things happen, you have, even though we are, we all want to deal with Hamas, we don't want, anybody here or Palestinian people here getting, the little boy, I believe it was in Chicago, who was brutally murdered and things like that. It was like these, and after 9/11, we had to deal with this. And, George Bush went and visited a mosque. These are the kind of things we have to continue doing, and we can't let that rhetoric get out of hand. And I know after Donald Trump was elected in 2016, I vocally did not support him. One of the first things I did was I went to visit the mosque, the largest mosque in my district, to make a point of, I know how concerned you are, and I am going to stand with you, because that was something that I knew was going to be a very difficult situation for them. And it did continue to be.
One of the things that we're seeing as a consequence to a lot of this is that more and more Americans are saying that political violence is acceptable and sometimes necessary in certain circumstances.
Again, on the right and the left.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. This is across the board. Now, I've tried to explain to a lot of folks that because of the way that this country seems to be splitting down the middle, each right and left side seems to think that the other is a threat to democracy. If you're on the right, you're seeing socialism and leftist, whatever they want to call the folks on the left, as a threat to democracy. If you're a Democrat, if you're on the left, you see all of the things that Donald Trump's doing as a threat to democracy. And all of those people are, whether you agree or not, there's a lot of folks in that group that are not radicals. They just believe that way, and they're willing to accept some violence to protect. That is trying to bridge that between those two camps who would take up arms against each other for vastly different reasons, but all in the name of saving democracy, really is I think, a road to disaster, potentially.
And again, I think, our political leaders and our religious leaders, community leaders, have to step up and, say, this is unacceptable. We cannot, there's, it's just not something, we saw it, in Virginia, we saw it in Charlottesville, and it was not both sides. And, these things have to be disavowed when we see them. And again, it has to be, spoken out against, on a bipartisan basis, and step up and say it, and it just, the silence is what has gotten, on this kind of violence is what's been concerning.
You've started we talked about a second ago in your introduction, a new organization for respect to the rule of law. Yeah. For folks out there that are non-lawyers, the rule of law can also be in the eyes of the beholder. I mean, we have 9 people on the Supreme Court for a reason. They have different views, but as a concept, it is a respect for the institutions of government. It's a respect for the law that's on the books, and providing some order to society and other things. Tell us a little bit about the organization and what you hope to achieve with your new organization.
Well, it's a new organization, and it's a lot of those of us who started are center right, but it's really open to all who are just concerned about really being more vocal about how the law has been misused. You've certainly seen that since January 6th. The individuals who fortunately are being brought to justice. The laws take a while. We're seeing many of the cases, in January 6th are being brought. People, whether it's the Jeff Clarks of the world who are at the Justice Department, or the many people who tried to misuse the law, are going through the system. We saw yesterday the, people who tried to, say they were electors, even though they were not electors. Those cases are going forward now. And, even the people who were, standing by Donald Trump to the end, who are now pleading guilty, I guess, whether it's Sidney Powell or people like that. But because there haven't been more lawyers out speaking about it, we wanted to be more vocal about, the legal cases. And in many cases, it's conservative lawyers. When you look at those 60 cases that where time after time Donald Trump was kicked to the curb between November 2020 and before January 6th, it was conservative lawyers who were saying no. In Pennsylvania cases, in Nevada, in Georgia, it was conservative lawyers who had been supported by the conservative legal community to be confirmed. Often they were attacked by liberals, maybe some folks here who didn't like them. Donald Trump had said, they're my lawyers. And no, fortunately, they weren't Donald Trump's lawyers. He always likes to call everyone my people, my lawyers. These were people who were true to the Constitution. So, we'd like to highlight these were people who were true to the Constitution and did stand up. And, there are great quotes in a lot of these cases where they just point out that there was nothing factual in any of these cases. And you just go, time through, and there was also, I guess about a year or two, it's over a year now, but a group of lawyers like Judge Tom Griffith and Mike Ludig and Ben Ginsburg, who went through all of the, allegations of fraud, in each of these states. And they went through very carefully, these very, good lawyers and former judges and election lawyers, and discounted all of these. And it just really needs, more, highlighting of the very detailed legal work that's been done. So we just felt there weren't enough people out there highlighting these things. And as these legal cases come up, we just wanted to give, more voice to that. And as new, bogus legal things come out of, the guy who may be the Republican nominee, we just want to be able to speak out to that and support, people like our election workers who often don't have those voices and microphones, and people who need to be protecting them.
Well, that's where I was going to go next. I mean, one of the things we've also seen, this is not just members of Congress and Supreme Court justices that are on the receiving end of these threats. We're seeing it now going down to local level, whether it's a local judge who gives a ruling, whether it is an election worker. We saw that a lot in the 2020 election. We fortunately did not see as much in 2022. But if you hear the words across the country, election workers are getting scared. They don't want, various states are having trouble getting poll workers who just are there to man the polls to make sure people can get a ballot and vote. There's a lot of things that I think that local folks can do. I mean, school board officials, city council, there's a lot of things that I think people can do that are not taking those steps. I know in Georgia, they've worked. There was an article that you and I were talking about with the Secretary of State. They're strengthening their laws to make sure that any allegation gets shot down real quick, that they're going to have a
yeah, and
full
actually, and
fair.
this was Brad Raffensperger, you know, who's certainly a hero, wrote there's a great article on nationalreview.com. So I recommend that to the audience. And it was with other Republicans, the Lieutenant Governor of Utah, and a number of other Republican officials who talk about very detailed work they've been doing in the states to provide more confidence in their elections. And they note that, you know, in 2022, how secure the elections were and how they did refute all of the, you know, allegations, even, you know, in Arizona. And, you know, they certainly, you know, in Georgia, you know, certainly Brad Raffensperger himself was abused, and a lot of the election workers were there. And you think of, you know, the two women who testified in the January 6th case, who now are bringing, you know, cases against Rudy Giuliani for the abuse that they suffered. Right. Because again, those kind of people do not have, those poor women do not have the voice. And thank goodness for the January 6th committee for defending them and giving them a voice to be able to talk about what happened to them. But you have people like out in Arizona, Bill Gates, who was a supervisor, not Bill Gates of Microsoft, but right. Bill Gates, who was a long-suffering supervisor who went through the 2020 election and 2022 election, who got attacked by both Donald Trump and then by Carrie Lake, and for not, you know, throwing out valid votes. And if you haven't read a story that the Washington Post did back in May of this year, I would recommend it highly, because it is just a heartbreaking story of what Bill Gates went through. He's not running again for election. And this is what people who are our heroes, who saved our democracy in 2020, and then again in 2022, what they had to go through. And he was not defended by, you know, other Republicans in Arizona. He wasn't defended really by Governor Ducey, who, you know, thank goodness Governor Ducey didn't go along with the fraud that, you know, Donald Trump wanted him to. But as Bill Gates and others on the front lines were being attacked, there was a lot of silence. His family was threatened. People said, I hope your daughters get raped. His family, his wife and daughters had to move away to another place to live while the state Senate was saying, well, we're going to audit this again. You remember the crazy audit that they went through for months and months and months. At one point, they were talking about maybe arresting him for not turning over all kinds of documents that he legally was not allowed to turn over. And they went through months and months and months of abuse and threats and death threats. And he's just a local supervisor who doesn't have the protections that we had in Congress and the Capitol Police. And so this was just a very abusive process. And he ended up, the story, you know, he's talked about this publicly. He had to go through therapy for this. And his therapist identified this as PTSD. I mean, he went through, you know, it was PTSD for saving our democracy. And, you know, these are the heroes, you know, who are on the front line, people like Brad Raffensperger. So now they are out there doing this. Last week, I was at the Hoover Institution, which is doing an effort called Revitalizing American Institutions. One of their projects is working on election issues. And again, Ben Ginsburg and the Lieutenant Governor and others are working, of Utah, that was part of this article also working on very simple ways of providing that security. Utah, Republican state, 98% of their votes are done beforehand on,
And safe and secure.
and safe and secure.
Yeah.
And, they bring people through and surprise, when Donald Trump's not on the ballot, the voting all goes really securely and safely. And this year in Virginia, we had a 51-49 House, very close elections. And some of those ones at the end were decided very closely. A 21-19 Senate, again, very close. But great credit to our governor, Republican governor, and to our Republican chairman and Democrat chairman, because after that election was over, they all stood together and said, these elections were safe and secure, they were fair, and they went out there and provided that security and said, things were fair, we decided this, and they did not feed into that paranoia.
You know,
that's what we need to be doing.
And what the other piece of that is on a local level. It's one thing to see members of Congress. It's one thing to see presidential candidates or whatever saying and doing some things, but so much can be accomplished at the very local level, a precinct level, a county level, a state level, with not only just leaders, political leaders, but faith leaders and veterans, community folks that can do. And now, one of the things that
And you have to stand up, what they went through in Arizona, and think, in Georgia, Governor Kemp did stand up for Brad Raffensperger and for his people, unlike what happened in Arizona. And you've got to do that. That is, if you're a leader and you're not standing up for your guys on the front line.
And I would encourage people, just the folks that are voters that voted and supported somebody, when they see them, they don't have to say things in a threatening way, but they can call that office, call your legislator, call your member of Congress and say, I don't appreciate those comments. I voted for you. I support you and the things you stand for, but I don't support that. And you need to tone this down a little.
And another great thing that, like, Governor Cox of Utah, Republican, and his opponent before his last election, they went out and did ads and said, hey, whoever wins, we're gonna fair and square. And then I think Governor Cox and Governor of Colorado, sorry, I'm blanking.
Polis. Jared Polis.
Have been doing similar sort of public service announcements on, hey, can't we get along here on things?
Right.
And I think in the same election space. So I think we need to do a lot more of what was done in Virginia this year, standing up for your election workers, standing up after close races, and being, good winners and good losers. And I know I won elections, very close elections. My first was 422 votes. And I have, and the woman who, who I won, that night, she was so gracious and called me in with a lovely concession, which I repeated years later when I lost, because she was so gracious, and we are friends now. And that's the spirit of what we need to do in this country, and get back to that. And I do think that's happening more often than not.
I do too. And I don't think media is covering some of that. And I think we really need to promote that. We've kind of gone a lot. We've talked a lot here. Maybe it's time we could go on and on about this. You could probably tell that both of us feel very strong. I did. But we would like to save a few minutes for time for questions. We've got probably some folks virtually, and anybody in the audience that might want to ask something, we'll try to answer, or we'll just tell you what we want to hear anyway. Here we go. We got a microphone for you. Don't turn it off.
Senator, Congresswoman, you've talked a lot about the threats you got while you were in office, but what was the impact of that on your staffers who were, getting that every day? Or do you think it caused them to think about their future in public service?
No, of course it did. It absolutely did. But, look, a lot of them, Barbara and I were talking about this ahead of time. Some of them were interns, that were there, that were like high school kids or college kids that were there. And the person on the other end of the phone had no clue who they were talking to. And yes, it did impact. But I know that from our standpoint, and my guess is Barbara did too, we tried to make sure we rotated folks enough to where they weren't getting too subjected. But at the same time, we wanted to give them a bigger experience too, that there's more to it than the crazies that are calling you. And so ultimately, I'm hoping that the folks that came through my office that experienced that will use that experience to then spread the word about why that kind of crap shouldn't happen anymore. Barbara, you agree?
Yeah, no, and that was, I mean, I do remember one time, and I think it may have been during the Kavanaugh hearings. And of course,
Did you vote for on the
yeah,
Kavanaugh
I was a
confirmation
member
tonight?
of the House who did not vote for a judge. And so, or a Supreme Court justice, and yet people were calling and screaming at my interns. So an intern who was like nearly in tears, like this is her first day and she's getting screamed at about this. And so, they're trying to explain, and people didn't like when you explained, well, she doesn't vote on it. And so they didn't like being told, like, you don't know what you're talking about. So when people got that irrational and horrible, I did tell my staff that when they're being obscene or nasty to you, you can hang up on them. But your staff is worried, oh, are you going to lose a vote if you're being nasty to them? And I had to tell them, no, if someone's that awful to you, and sometimes if I were walking by, I would grab the phone if I saw they were being, it's like, you can't, you're yelling at a young person. This is unacceptable. So it is.
But I do think we're seeing some members of Congress.
Like you could be mean to
leaving.
me. You don't do that to my staff.
I do think we're seeing a lot of retirements from Congress today because of the vitriol, the bitterness, the divisiveness, and the threats of not just to them, to their families. I mean, we're now even seeing it not just across right to left anymore. We saw it in the Republican caucus with the fight for the speaker.
Yeah.
That
was real. I mean, that only 20 people voted against Jim Jordan on the floor, yet when they had a secret ballot, he only had 80 votes. That's what the death threats, that's the impact, that's the difference right there. And when you had a member say, well, gee, if you vote for him, you won't get the death threats.
Right.
Wow. That's how they think about it. And and Liz Cheney has written about that members would come up and say that to her. And that is real. And, some of the members who, that will privately talk to you about that, they know it does impact them, and it impacts them because they're concerned about their family. It also impacts, say, former staffers of the former president about whether they might speak out. And so if you read, I was at an event with Jonathan Karl recently, and he read a very devastating quote from somebody who worked very closely, very senior person who worked very closely with Donald Trump. And they expressed that, how unfit Donald Trump was and never should be back in the White House, but they wouldn't say it publicly for fear of harm to their family.
And if anybody ever questions whether there is a need for gag orders in certain cases that are pending in criminal courts around this country, you only have to look at what goes on and happens where people stand up and speak out and are witnesses or potential jurors. And so that's why we have that rule of law, and that's why there are.
But I would say I do realize a lot of people can't speak out, and that's why I think some of us who feel we can do, because I do appreciate that some just aren't in a position to, and I don't begrudge them for not speaking for it. They all have individual situations, but I also do think there's safety in numbers too, that the more who speak out, and that's why I think you do see more military speaking out and the threats there. I mean, the threaten execution and things like that. I think more people see how unacceptable that is.
Somebody else? We got one from
online,
our virtual audience.
Question from the online audience. Related to the media coverage, Senator Jones, what would you suggest the media do differently? Most journalists are as alarmed and surprised as you are and are often targeted as well. So what sort of coverage do you think would make most of a difference?
Look, I think that they have to challenge a little bit more rather than just report. I think that right now, and I'll give you a good example of that. I saw, and she's a friend, I saw Dana Bash on CNN. In two different situations. One, she challenged Representative Jayapal about comments that she made concerning rape of Israeli women. She challenged her, really challenged her. And I think that that was appropriate. Last night after the debate, she challenged Mr. Ramaswamy for comments that he made about the replacement theory, which is inciting so many people. So I think that the media can not only bring this to the people's attention, but I think that they can also challenge in the right way with facts and report these in that way, rather than just making this just another news story that will come and go, because it's a major problem. But and right, we left out the media. The media is getting as much of this as public officials. And
the death threat, I mean, they are getting,
Yes.
they get death threats too. And it's not like they have, I mean, they drive home alone at night. They don't have big
Right.
details or anything. So they are bravely reporting on a lot of this. And, you know, and people who do tell them things, whether it's confidentially or not, you know, they're bravely reporting these things. And those were great, you know, that Dana reported that. Pressed on that in both of those instances, you know, from you know, both on a Democrat and a Republican instance. Those were great cases where she was really pressing, and those are hard things to do because neither of them are people who want to respond.
well, neither of them, though, to be fair, I think intended to cause violence. I really don't believe that on either one of those, but she needed to push back because of what we said, the unintended consequences of people that are out there that are hearing things in a certain way that may give that permission structure.
Yeah.
Anybody else here?
We have time for one more question. Down front.
We're running late. I'll let
Senator, Congresswoman, thank you very much for your time. I have a question. So Reverend Michael Langer, I'm a ordained minister. So my question is, and I apologize, I'm getting over a little bit of laryngitis. What role does the faith community play in helping America to kind of move through this political violence? I'm well aware that many of the folks who showed up on January 6th had some kind of a faith allegiance and thought they were doing something beneficial to the greater Christian cause. I'm also aware that oftentimes Christians who call Washington offices start by saying, I wanted to let you know I'm a Christian, and then descend into some of the horrible things that have been said to your staff people. So I'm sorry. The issue that most pastors that I talk to have is if they even approach navigating the public square in a church service, it's a church split. It's so insidious there. What encouragement would you give to leaders in the faith community to help kind of extinguish some of the problems we're facing right now?
All right, I'm gonna give that a shot. Coming from a state with a really strong evangelical community across the state that I think has become, the term evangelical to me has become more of a political term than a religious term. And I think that if there is any leader in the faith community that gets back to the teachings of their faith and not politics, and not letting their political persuasions override the teachings of love, the teachings of justice, then I don't know why they're even behind a pulpit, to be honest with you, because their job is not to get somebody elected. Their job is to tender to their flock and teach people and try to make our country, our society, our communities, their own community, love each other a little more, respect each other a hell of a lot more. That's their role. And I would tell them that they've got to get out of their political comfort zone and stand up, because they can have more impact on this country by getting away from politics then they can have more impact by talking about community and each other and respecting each other. That is not easy to do with today's faith community. The most vocal, the ones on TV, the ones out there making money. Okay. That's another thing I won't go into the money part of this. But I think the bottom line is do your job, do what God called you to do what your faith called you to do at the time, because your faith, I would bet at the time that they made that decision to enter the community of faith as a leader, they weren't saying, I need to do this so I can get X person elected president or governor. They did it to help people, and they just need to get back to that. That's my view.
Yeah, no, that's I'm Catholic, and I just started reading a little bit of Tim Alberta's book, so I think he has some great advice in there. But I was thinking back to 2016, and in 2016, Justice Scalia had passed, and so that whole issue was there with the court. And Father Scalia, his son, who's a priest, was priest at my church at one time. And I was, so at this point, I had the Access Hollywood tape had come out. I was not voting for Donald Trump. And it was a couple of weeks before the election, and I was attending a fundraiser for kind of a home for unwed mothers in a part of my district, and Father Scalia was speaking there. So it was kind of an event that was, because Justice Scalia had passed, Father Scalia is speaking there. It's a little bit of a political event. No, it wasn't political. Of course, it was non-political, but people had come, given all of this. And he gave a lovely and very eloquent non-political speech, even though the whole atmosphere is ripe with that. And what his speech was about, what goes on in your home. And I'm simplifying it but is more important in your house than what goes on in the House of Representatives or any of these government things. And he's basically was telling everyone, like, he wasn't saying it that way. I know that's what I was hearing. So it was, don't get all caught up in this. He said, in my family, because he was really talking about his family. When he went home every night, he was talking about his mom, his dad, what went on at our dining room table. That's really what mattered.
Right.
Our faith, the gifts of faith that you give your family, that's eternal. That's what's going to matter. And don't get caught up in everything. And the people there, that's what they were there for, to give those gifts to the next generation and the things they cared about. And so we did not talk anything about politics there, which was really what was lovely about that event. And I was going there really kind of at peace that Donald Trump was going to lose the election. I was going to lose the election because I had come out against him. And I was very happy to have this faith experience there. Yeah.
I think we're done.
So I think the thing is, the church tells us as Christians that we've already won. Jesus has won it for us. We've won. And that was a message that Father Scalia was kind of telling everyone. Jesus has already won this for you. Worry about Jesus, worry about your family. And that, that battle's been won. The eternal battle's been won. So don't get caught up in
which frankly,
battles.
Yeah, it's frankly a battle. Frankly, a message that could be used in other faiths.
Yeah,
as well.
Exactly. Well, and I think yes, and all
the
faiths teach that that this is. So I think the church, when the church gets back to that, then government can do right. Government would benefit from that, because then we'd all be helping our neighbors and doing all the things that Father Scalia in all of our churches, I think we'd be helped by helping us do that.
So that's probably an interesting time to end on this. Thank you all for joining us. Those that are here virtually, thank you for joining us. We want to thank CAP again, the Center for American Progress. If you want to know more about CAP and the work we do, you can look at americanprogress.org. Want to thank the McCain Institute and all of the work that they do. And you can find them at mccaininstitute.org. And if you're interested in the poll, that Barb and I talked about. You can go to the Former Members of Congress Association website, which is usamfmc.org. And you can find out that work and also that poll. So thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Stay tuned for more along these lines. Thank you.